Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight we're continuing on with our Journey to Faith series. This is actually lesson number 40. So we've progressed a long way. This is 40 weeks of teaching. This is very much beyond a Bible college course at this point in time. We've been following the genealogy of Jesus. We started Abraham, and of course we work all the way through 40 generations. So we're currently following King David, and King David is the 14th descendant of Abraham, so we've still got a long ways to go. But the Old Testament's a book that's not often taught or taught well. It's usually only used in context with pointing back in Scripture in order to see the fulfilment of it in the New Testament. But of course, there's many lives and purposes of the Old Testament. David, of course, is part of the prophecy of Jesus. David is very significant in the Bible. He has a large content in the Bible, and frankly, without him, the fulfilment of the prophecy that Jesus came would actually not be there in place. And so this is the fourth lesson now on King David, and last week we were following the components of his journey where he was actually unifying the kingdom of Israel, and there was a variety of situations happened, including when he sinned. And of course this sin was when he had a lustful moment. He saw the lady Bathsheba from his palace next door. Uriah the Hittite, her husband, was away fighting, and of course David called her to the palace and ended up sleeping with her. She fell pregnant, and as a consequence of that, David made a decision that since she was now pregnant, that he would call Uriah back from the battlefield in order that he could lay with her to cover up what he had actually done. Of course, Uriah, being a good fellow, decided that it wasn't right that he would go home to his wife when everyone else was fighting, so he actually didn't go back to see her. And so good old David decided instead that he would have him sent out into the thick of battle where his chances of being killed were increased. And of course this is actually what happened. So David's actions led him to commit adultery, and then to also, in a de facto sense, commit murder. And so there was a punishment that came from God for doing this, and those punishments came in the form of 3 curses. And so we find this week, as we enter into the story, that David's son Absalom becomes one of those generational curses for which David was actually given by God. And so this is where we're going to pick up tonight. So he has a daughter, and her name is called Tamar. So one of David's daughters is called Tamar, T-A-M-A-R. Oh, I'm sorry, the lesson tonight is called David's son Absalom challenges the throne, and so this is where we're heading with Absalom, which we're just about to introduce. So David had a son Absalom. He had other sons as well, and he had a daughter called Tamar, and he had another wife whose name was Ahinoam, and she bore him a son who was called Amnon. So these are names which are not the Solomons or the Nathans of the New Testament. They're not the Solomon of the Old Testament, whom has a large story which we're going to come to soon. But in fact they're people that we don't know so well. But Absalom's story becomes a significant component of David's journey, and we're going to cover that tonight. So going to Tamar, as she grew, the Bible tells us that she matured into a very beautiful woman, and Amnon, who was her brother, fell in love with her. You have to understand the circumstances here, and that's the fact that there's more than one wife. And so these women were having children by David, and yet they weren't by the same mother. So in these ancient times, it was actually a fairly common thing that there was intermarriage that was actually happening. And so I guess, giving that as a baseline, it probably wasn't so unusual that Amnon sought to have a relationship with whom he saw as a half-sister. Remember, Abraham himself was actually married to his half-sister as well. So Tamar, as an unmarried woman, however, was kept away from all men. So this was the tradition of the time, and she was unaware of his feelings. It was impossible for Amnon to see her, but Amnon had a friend called Jonadab, who was the son of David's brother Shimea, in whom he confided and was advised to pretend to be sick and ask his father to have Tamar prepare some food for him at his house. So we see human nature at its best here, men wheedling and getting their mates to help them out to achieve an outcome which they shouldn't actually be looking for. So David agreed to this, and the deception in fact took place. So Tamar prepared food for Amnon, but when she brought it to him, he confronted her and asked her to sleep with him. She rejected him, but he didn't take no for an answer. And he used his physical strength and he raped her. Having been rejected, Amnon's love switched to hatred and he threw her out of the house in shame. So what a consequence. He went for what he wanted, she didn't want, and now he's actually committed a crime against her, and now he's actually rejected her and thrown her out of the house. So this poor girl, Tamar, has just suffered through this whole situation. So Tamar's brother Absalom learnt of what happened and took her into his house to live, but he told Tamar not to tell anyone, and she kept quiet. Tamar felt completely desolate. Sounds like a modern movie, doesn't it? So Tamar felt completely desolate. Despite Absalom's intentions, David does hear what happened and he's furious. And Absalom, who hates his half-brother for what he did, no longer speaks to him. But this is not the end of it. And so now we're going to start turning to the scripture. So this is the background of the story. So 2 years had passed when King David's son Absalom came to him, and he said in 2 Samuel, so first scripture for tonight, 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 24. He says, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his officials please join me?" King David was being invited to a feast at Baal Hazor near the border of Ephraim. A time of celebration when the sheep were being shorn, but he replied in verse 25, "No, my son, all of us should not go. We would only be a burden to you." Absalom pressed him again, and although King David gave him his blessing, he still refused to go. Abraham then asked his father in verse 26, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." But King David was rightfully concerned, for he knew of the animosity between the two over the rape of Tamar. So he questioned Absalom why, and only receiving continued requests, he decided to let Amnon go on the proviso that the rest of his sons went with him. So during the festivities, when Amnon had consumed much wine, Absalom had his men kill him. His brothers fled on their mules, and Absalom fled to his mother's father, King Tamar of Geshur, and remained there. So I'll put the first slide up for tonight. This is a map. This is a map which will give you familiarity with the location. So where he went was from here at Jerusalem all the way up to Geshur, and Geshur is obviously on the other side, on the Jordanian side today, and it's next to the Sea of Galilee at the top of the escarpment. So this is the place where he went. So at first, King David mourned the loss of Amnon, then 3 years passed without seeing his son Absalom. He grew to miss Absalom terribly and mourned every day that they were apart. Joab, the commander of David's army, was also his nephew and knew his uncle's heart. He knew David was bereaved and longed to see his son Absalom. So he devised a plan to convince David to bring his son back to Jerusalem. Joab had a wise woman from Tekoa in the desert of Jeriel, south of Jerusalem, come to see David in the palace. And so this location is down here. So this is where the wise woman lived to the south. Upon his instructions, the woman pretended to be a widow and said in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 5 to 7, "I am indeed a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well.' They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth." David realised that Joab put her up to this. Asking her, she agreed. David clearly understood her plea for help was a means to speak into his circumstances, so he turned to Joab and said in verse 21 of 2 Samuel chapter 14, "Very well, I will do it. Go bring back the young Absalom." So we see the plot starting to develop with these other people. So Joab went up to Geshur and brought back Absalom, but on his arrival, King David still did not want to see him. So verse 24, he says, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom lived separately in his own house for 2 years without seeing his father. He fathered 3 sons and a daughter of his own, whom he named Tamar. She too was beautiful, like her auntie of the same name. And so, just to give you a bit of a summation, so the murder was committed. Then we race away up to Geshur. This lady comes from Tekoa, tells the story. He's taken back from Geshur and brought back to Jerusalem. So this is what's happening up to this point in time. So eventually, Absalom convinced Joab to visit his father on his behalf. He explained to David how his son had expressed the pointlessness of returning to Jerusalem when he could have stayed in Geshur if he was not prepared to see him. David relented and summoned his son, who came and bowed down before him. David kissed him, but all was not well, for Absalom began to conspire against him. So obviously David's upset. He had one son kill another son, and that other son had raped his daughter. Remember the curses that David was given? Right? Yeah. And so we start to see the curse that God gave David playing out. He says that descendants from every generation will die a violent death. You will see before your very eyes your own wives taken and given to a man from your own family, which hasn't yet happened, and the son born to you will die, which has happened, from Bathsheba. So 2 of the 3 curses have already come to place since David did the wrong thing, and the 3rd one is on its way. And so as a Bible, we trust it to be the Word of God, and when a word is given by God, it is always fulfilled. And so we see here in this story the fulfillment of what God said would actually happen. So after Absalom received his father's pardon, he boldly acquired a chariot with horses and 50 men to run before him. Clearly he was not missed, and people love to look upon royalty. Bit of a royal spotter, you know, he's got a fancy chariot, got his horses out there, and he goes out into the public to be seen. So Absalom began his appeal to gain public support to be their king. He removed the need to observe protocol by making himself available to all by rising early in the morning and standing on the side of the road at the entrance to Jerusalem's city gates. Any Israelite who came to petition his father for a legal decision, he would say his father had no representative to hear them, but promised that justice would be served should he be able to judge. In this way, he undermined his father's authority for 4 years, gradually winning their loyalty. So he was bypassing everything that was coming into the city. So 4 peaceful years passed since King David's son bowed at his feet in repentance. Absalom came to see him and asked in 2 Samuel chapter 15 now, verses 7 to 9, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill the vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram," so this is the Geshem up here, that we were talking about. He said, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron. The king said to him, go in peace. So he went to Hebron, in verses 7 to 9. Why do you think he's saying this? Why do you think he wants to go to Hebron down here? What's significant about Hebron? Do you remember?
Close to the Philistines.
Close to the Philistines, but David's already sorted the Philistines. What else happened at Hebron? To do with King David?
Anointed.
Right. He first ruled Judah from
Hebron. Oh.
Hebron. Hebron is also one of the 40 priestly cities in the kingdom of Israel. And so there's a priesthood here, and so he seeks to set himself up as a king of the south. So his plan is to come away from Jerusalem. He's got his following, he's got people who are starting to recognise him, and he's going to come and set up camp here separate and away from David. Okay, so he's up to no good, but he's going back to the very same place that David ruled from. So we know from this that David had a palace, a premises, from which he ruled from in Hebron, and so now his son is going there to take the same authority that his father had in that same location. So he received the blessing of his father, David, and Absalom decided it was time to strike. So he went to Hebron and amplified his conspiracy in earnest. He sent messages to all the tribes of Israel with a message in 2 Samuel 15:10. And he said, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron. So 200 men, without knowledge of Absalom's intent, went with him as his guests, and offering his sacrifices on his arrival, Absalom sent for David's counsellor, Ahithophel the Gilonite, from his hometown. Absalom's followers continued to increase in number, and his conspiracy against his father gained strength. Encouraged by David's failure to act, Absalom set out one morning with his men, expecting to reach Jerusalem by noon, and David was alerted by a messenger who told him in verse 13, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And so we see another casing point in history, the one that I always recognise from our previous century is, of course, Adolf Hitler. Right? He did things, and people didn't believe he would do the next thing, so they let him go. But so he just kept taking the next step and the next step until the whole world was embroiled in a war. And he took over a large amount of territory of Europe. And so we see here that Absalom's done the same. First of all, he's called some men to his side, he's changed his location, and then he's declared that this is my territory, but David doesn't act. And so he now becomes emboldened to take yet another step. So there's a message in this for all of us. If someone's committing something that's wrong, and you fail to stop them when they're doing it, you're going to empower them to actually take another step, which is going to come against you. So sometimes in life we need to stand up at a point where we do what is right. It's not a case of, oh, you know, the other person will correct their ways. No, you stand for what's right. And you stop it in its tracks where it's actually happening before it gets bigger. And so this is what's happening here. So hearing of Absalom's approach a few hours before he arrived with his men, King David decided to leave Jerusalem, rather than risk any harm from a siege or try and fight with insufficient men. So this tells us that David's become a bit of a soft king, perhaps. You know, he's united the kingdom, there's no external threats coming against him, so he's probably relaxed. He's probably relaxed his military, and so of course when this event happens he's not prepared for it. And so taking his entire household except 10 concubines he left behind to care for the palace. So David went east across the Kidron Valley, and there was quite a procession that followed him. His men, the high priest Zadok, the Levites carrying the ark of God, the Kerethites and the Pelethites, the 600. Gittites accompanied him from Gath and all of their families, and as they went, those that they passed by wept in sorrow. So they saw their king leaving at the approach of his son. And so it's quite incredible, isn't it, what's actually happening? And so we have a picture here for you, two pictures I should say, and this is the Kidron Valley and what it actually looks like. Now I'm going to play a video in a moment, but up on this side here, well, this is the wall for the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This is the Kidron Valley. This church here is the church at Gethsemane, and this is the Mount of Olives, this mountain on this side. And so this valley is where they cross. But keep in mind that David's city is actually down around the bend here. It's further south. So when he crossed, he would have come out of the city and he would have ended up on top of this peak here somewhere. This picture here is further down. So this is at the top of the valley. So down here where this pathway is, this photo is taken somewhere about here looking further south. And so this is what it looks like down around the bend. Now it's a bit of a messy place today. There's a lot of bad history that happened in this area and it hasn't been built on. But this area on this hill now is all occupied. This is part of the Muslim enclave opposite the city of Jerusalem there. And so this is all contested territory in modern history. But this is the valley that David crossed until he got up onto the other side. And so I'm going to pop up a video and you can have a look at what this actually looks like from the other side. On the outside of I was sitting here looking across from the other side, my way down to Bethany where Lazarus was risen from the dead, and down to Bethlehem and heaven today. Just to stop here to full to sort of get a picture of the scale of this. We're literally above this area and one of the tombs are, and the road that intersects it, so going to descend to our right, pointing over here. So this is the Kidron Valley up here. Tombs, yeah. They're very small up here, so I feel that these are children on this platform. So there's the Alaska Mosque and the little gate that way, and back across, and looking at that road, the entrance. So here, David's city is down this way. Here. So here we are. So we'll just go back to So that video you can see, so we're up on the Mount of Olives side pointing back towards the old city of Jerusalem. And so you can see the big long city wall there of Jerusalem. Where I was filming, we're on the Mount of Olives close to the Garden of Gethsemane, facing across, but the valley, that Kidron Valley, goes down around the bend, as I was saying, and further down on here. But the film footage just gives you a bit of a feel for the place. It's quite bleak. It's very dry when we were there, so it's not very green at all. But it gives you an idea that when David crossed, this is actually the place. This is where it actually happened. So having travelled part way up the Mount of Olives, the Bible says that King David halted. The ark of God was set down, and Abiathar the priest offered sacrifices until all the people had left the city. Before they went any further, King David told Zadok in 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 25, "Take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favour in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again." He also said in verses 27 to 28, "Aren't you a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan son of Abiathar. You and Abiathar take your 2 sons with you. I will wait at the fords in the desert until word comes from you to inform me." So the fords of the desert are actually the fords of Jordan, which is near where Jericho is. That's what this is actually talking about. So I'll just pop that back on the map. So the fords of Jericho are right here. And so here's Jerusalem. They're heading off to the east and they're going to go down, and he says he's going to wait right here, and this is that purple line on the map that he's actually talking about there.
David realizes this is a part of his sin, the sin he's committed, and that's why he doesn't fight against it. He says, this is God's curse on my life.
Well, he's showing 2 things, I believe. First of all, I agree, he recognises that he's sinned, and he was told that these things would happen to him, and so now it's happening. The other thing is that we see in David's character we see someone who doesn't go against God's will.
Yeah.
So even though he committed a sin, he never rebels against God. That's one of the things that sets David apart. He's human, he has a sin nature, he does the wrong thing, but he never rebels against God himself. And so you see here, he's leaving the city, he's bringing the priest with him and the Ark of the Covenant, so it's almost like he's going to take God with him. But he realises, well, no, the city, this is God's city. The Ark of the Covenant, David has already been told that his son Solomon will actually build the temple there. The Ark of the Covenant will go in the temple. So David almost doesn't have a right to take this away from God's city. And so he realises that, you know, the things that he's actually doing is probably not going to endear him to God. In fact, he's going to separate himself from God, because he's taking his destiny in his own hands here. He's not listening to God. He's not following what God's asked him to do at this point in time. He's knee-jerk reacting to what his son's actually doing. His son's doing what he's doing because God's actually said you're going to be cursed and some of these things are going to come against you. And so we see this situation happening. But David's character always shows that he's this man who always respects God no matter what he's done wrong. And so this is part of his journey. So having travelled part way up, so we said, so he travelled halfway up and he'll meet him at the fords in the desert. So David's very careful for the safety of the ark of God, but he realises that he needs to leave his faith in the hands of God, as I was just saying, and return the ark to his dwelling place in Jerusalem. God was to be served by those whose lives were dedicated to him, Zadok and the Levite priesthood. So David's question, remember I've just said, where he said, "Aren't you a seer?" was quite unusual, for it indicated that Zadok would serve a special role like a prophet. The prophets Nathan and Gad, who had been serving God's purpose in David's life at this time, were still alive. But perhaps because they served David, they would not be well received by his son Absalom. Zadok and Abiathar, however, were priests who served God despite who ruled the earthly kingdom, and they would not simply fulfill roles of spies in the king's court, but reveal the events that would take place in Jerusalem that would show God's will concerning David. Okay, so we see this very purposeful understanding that David has. So King David's head was covered and his feet were bare as he wept and prayed, the Bible tells us. He ascended the road that went up the Mount of Olives. He had learnt that Ahithophel, one of his close advisors and the grandfather of his wife Bathsheba, had joined his son's conspiracy against him. So King David prayed that Ahithophel's counsel would be turned into foolishness, and when he arrived at the summit, another of his close advisors, Hushai the Archite, was there to meet him at a place where people went to worship God. So like the priests Zadok and Abiathar, King David also asked him to return to Jerusalem and help him by frustrating the advice of Ahithophel. King David told him to tell the priests anything he heard in the king's palace and to send their sons Ahimaaz and Jonathan to him with any information. So we find here that David's vacating, but he's going to leave people behind to listen into what's going on and to inform him of those events. So Hushai went down the Mount of Olives, and as he was entering the city, Absalom also arrived at the gate. So we can picture here, you know, that here's David, he's just across the other side. So David's on one side, and here's Absalom on the other side, and he's looking back as this is happening. So he's not very far away at this point in time. You can see the distance visually there. So King David continued on his way, but after a short time he came across a person called Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, which is a person I have a lot of problem pronouncing his name. So Ziba had deliberately waited for him with a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with food and wine. King David asked him why, and Ziba explained they were for his benefit and those that were travelling with him. And then King David asked him in 2 Samuel chapter 16 verse 3, "Where is your master's grandson?" Ziba explained that because King David was leaving, that Mephibosheth chose to remain in Jerusalem on the understanding that as King Saul's grandson, the house of Israel would be given back to him and he would become king. Upon the word, King David bequeathed all that belonged to Mephibosheth was now the property of Ziba. And so we understand a little bit more of the background now. So thanking Ziba, King David continued on the road east of Jerusalem that went to the Jordan Valley. Not far from the Mount of Olives was a village called Bahurim in the region given to the Benjamites. So the Benjamites are just to the north of Jerusalem. And it was a place where this fellow called Palti, son of Laish, who had married King David's first wife Michal, turned back as he cried when she was brought back to King David when he became king of Judah. So that comes from 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 16. And so there's all these people from the past and the present who are around David. Some are staying, some are going, and some are being encountered along the way who are helping him because he helped them in the past. So passing through the Benjamite land, a Benjamite by the name of Shimei, son of Gera, from the same clan as King Saul's family, came out and cursed King David as he pelted him and his officials with stones and sprayed them with dirt. Joab's brother Abishai, another of King David's nephews, wanted to cut off the head of this man, but King David told him, the other officials, that his own son Absalom was trying to kill him. So how much more did this Benjamite from the family of King Saul want to do the same? So Shimei was left to curse King David, for King David believed this was the will of God. And so we see this play happening from his immediate past. So after arriving at the palace in Jerusalem, although Absalom was consumed with his own sense of power, he sought the advice, funnily enough that King David understood this, of Ahithophel about what to do. He was advised to pitch a tent on the roof of the palace and lay with his father's 10 concubines to show all of Israel that his father regards him as his enemy. Absalom does this in full view of everyone, and a second punishment from God prophesied by Nathan comes against David for murdering Uriah the Hittite after sleeping with his wife Bathsheba. And so remember that second curse? He said, "You will see before your very eyes your own wives taken and given to a man from your own family who will sleep with them in broad daylight." So that's from 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 11 to 12. Okay, and the implication of that was that it wouldn't be in secret like it was with Bathsheba. And so now all three of the curses that David was given have come to pass. So next, Ahithophel told Absalom to send 12,000 men after David that same night, but only to kill him so that all the other people would return. Absalom and the elders of Israel thought this was a good plan, but Absalom also wanted to hear what Hushai the Archite would say. Hushai disagreed with his advice, saying it wouldn't work because David would hide separate to his troops, and if his troops did attack those of Absalom's first, then they would be slaughtered because David and his men were fierce fighters. So David had a reputation because he'd been evading King Saul for a long time and successfully fighting against him. This would then cause fear in the hearts of Absalom's men. Hushai recommended that Absalom himself lead all Israelite men from Dan to Beersheba against David, which would lead to both the death of David and all those who followed him. So we get a picture here that, when Absalom was reaching out to all the people of Israel, he really reached out to them. Here's David blissfully unaware in his palace in Jerusalem that Absalom's actually got all of this country behind him. It makes you sort of question, well, why did they turn against David? What did David do to them to make him turn against him? Absalom turned against him, and of course all of those people. It's very odd, isn't it? David was revered and loved. He unified the kingdom of Israel, and yet we find here that his son has turned against him and managed to turn all of those people. So this sort of shows you that, that moment where we said he should have stopped him in his tracks earlier on, how when you don't, it just keeps growing and growing and growing, and here he's got this large volume of people coming against him. So Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar what had transpired, and a servant girl was given a message from them to give to Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who went in turn to David and told him not to wait at the fords of the Jordan River in the desert, but to cross the other side. So David crossed over and went to the city of Mahanaim, where he was welcomed and taken in, whilst Absalom, who had attempted to catch David before he crossed the Jordan River, had Amasa, the cousin of Joab, lead his men over to the other camp in the land of Gilead. There's lots of names here, so you just have to sort of track the story. It's all in the Bible. Ahithophel, meanwhile, heard his advice, was not followed, and hung himself. And so this is where having the map is really helpful, because we can simplify this. David went here. Those who came after him chased him. He was told not to stay here, and in fact to go up to Mahanaim. Now Mahanaim was actually another palace. Do you remember? Mahanaim was where King Saul resided. So when David was ruling from Hebron, King Saul moved out to Mahanaim in order to keep his distance from King David. And so this location is obviously available, and now David is on the run, and he's actually gone to this particular palace rather than stopping here at the fords of Jericho. And so we see this story continue to unfold. So King David, he said, they crossed the fords of the Jordan River. The Bible tells us in 2 Samuel 16 verse 1 that they shared a meal together while they waited at night. There was fresh loaves of bread, sweet figs and raisins, washed down with wine supplied by Ziba. They had not been settled long when the two messengers I mentioned came along, and they were brought to King David, and after exchanging greetings in 2 Samuel chapter 17:21, it says, "Set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you." So King David gave the orders to break camp, and they crossed the Jordan River by the light of the moon. By daybreak, they crossed to the other side, and as I said, they made their way up to this place called Mahanaim. So King David and all of those with him were welcomed with open arms at Mahanaim by a fellow called Shobi, son of Nahash, who was from Rabbah of the Ammonites. So he was actually from here, this person who welcomed David up to Mahanaim. Sorry, just find where I was up to. So Machir, son of Amiel from Lo-Debar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim. So these are these different people who welcomed him. So from Lo-Debar. So Lo-Debar was, I had this on the map the other day, it's just here somewhere. Oh, there it is. There's Lo-Debar, Rogelim, and Rabbah. So they're those yellow spots that I've put on the map here. So these three people came and welcomed David to this place. So what's the significance of these people? So firstly, Shobi the Ammonite was the brother of Hanan, who humiliated David's delegates very badly in 2 Samuel chapter 10:4, when they were sent to pay respect for the death of their very cruel father. So it's thought that Shobi disliked the way David's delegates were treated by his brother, and after David conquered his city, he was given Ammon to govern with David's support and friendship. So David made amends for what had happened that was wrong. And so this person now was repaying the friendship that David gave him in the past. So now that David was in distress, Shobi showed his gratitude. Machir from Lo-Debar was the friend and protector of Mephibosheth, the crippled son of Jonathan. Of course, David loved Jonathan, the son of King Saul. So having witnessed the noble manner in which David had looked after him, he too decided to take care of David. So remember that David had this man at his table in Jerusalem. So he brought him into his household, he took care, he gave him all of his estate back, the territories here. And so now that they've gone over there, they're repaying him in kind. So that's the second person. And the third person was a fellow called Barzillai the Gileadite, and he was a very wealthy 80-year-old man, the Bible tells us, in 2 Samuel chapter 19 verse 32, who through a daughter of his became the ancestor of a family of priests known as the sons or descendants of Barzillai, But funny enough, where you find these is actually in the book of Ezra, in chapter 2, verses 61 to 63, because there's some genealogy there. He showed great respect and devoted loyalty when he too decided to take care of David, who in turn takes care of his sons at a later date. And so all these people had a purpose in David's life to take care of him. In 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 1, it says, David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. He divided his men into 3 under the command of Joab, his brother Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite, and said he would march out with them. They told him to remain behind and support them from the protection of the city, for they were well aware that Absalom was only interested in killing him. And so we find now that they've escaped, they've set up, and then they're now working out how to repel the threat of his son. So King David answered in verse 4 of 2 Samuel 18, I will do whatever seems best to you. So despite all that Absalom had done, he still loved him and had no desire to battle against him. So he stood by the city gates, and as his men marched out, he said to the commanders in verse 5, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. And so you can imagine his commanders who are under him, his sons usurped his throne. He's coming after him and he's still telling them, be kind to my son, I don't want you to touch him. And so it's quite an extraordinary situation. The Jewish historian writes about this, Josephus, and he says that David's army numbered 4,000. So whether this is accurate or not, the Bible, as I just said, it says that David's men had grown in number since he left Jerusalem, so there was those who were coming to join him. And it says, for he appointed 3 commanders of thousands, as well as the commanders of hundreds. So this aligns with what the Bible is telling us. So David's army marched into the field to engage Absalom's men of Israel, but they were heavily outnumbered, so instead they fought a battle in a place called the Forest of Ephraim. Now the location for this is actually not known. There's nobody who's been able to find out exactly where it is. But what we do know is between the Jordan River and the city of Mahanaim, for Absalom crossed the Jordan River when he followed David from Jerusalem. So we don't know exactly where, but somewhere in this area here is where the Forest of Ephraim was, where the next part of the story takes place. It seems that this was a strategic decision employed by David's men, who had experience in fighting a more guerrilla style of warfare during the many years they had spent on the run hiding from King Saul. The advantage of this favoured a smaller number. Commanding a larger army was much more difficult to manoeuvre amongst trees that also afforded protection from being struck by arrows, darts, javelins and stones. So the battle rages through the forest, and the army of Israel under Absalom's commander Amasa was defeated with casualties, the Bible tells us, of 20,000 men. So David's 4,000 odd men defeated 20,000 in this style of warfare. During the battle, Absalom was seen by some of David's men riding his mule. Peculiarly, his mule did what?
Hung him up in a tree.
They hung him up on a tree?
Yeah.
Yeah, you remember the story?
Yeah.
So it's a peculiar story, this whole thing, isn't it? So during the battle, his mule went under some thick branches of an oak tree and he got caught by his head. Yeah. He left dangling in mid-air while it kept going. One of the men informed David's commander Joab, who returned, asked if he had killed him. Remember what David said, please don't hurt my son. Learning this, the soldier dared not kill Absalom because David had requested his son's protection. So Joab goes straight to Absalom with 3 javelins and plunged them into his heart. 10 of his armour bearers then came and struck him and killed him, which means they would have struck him with their swords or their javelins as well. So basically he was absolutely massacred by these men. So they were all determined to get rid of him despite what David requested. So Joab sounded his trumpet and his men stopped chasing the men of Israel. The battle was over and Absalom's men dispersed and fled to their homes. Joab's men took Absalom's body down from the tree and threw it into a large pit in the forest and covered it with a pile of stones. Obviously they were trying to hide the evidence of what they'd actually done. So during his lifetime, Absalom, so in 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 18, it says, during his lifetime Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself. And it's called Absalom's monument to this day. This is what the Bible actually says. Amazingly, you can go to Jerusalem today, and there, nestled in the Kidron Valley at the base of the Mount of Olives and near the Garden of Gethsemane, is Absalom's monument, still standing some 3,000 years later. And so we have a legacy. So for this complex story in the Bible, which essentially means that Absalom killed Amnon, who had raped Tamar, all children of David. He went to Geshur in hiding. David brought him back, told him he's not allowed to go outside and play for 3 years. So Absalom hated his father, so for being punished. So he said, what's the point in me being here if you're not going to forgive me? So David forgives him, and then he says, I had a prophetic word from the Lord, so this is the short version, a prophetic word from the Lord, that I was to go to Hebron and seek the Lord there. He gets to Hebron and declares himself king of this region, and then it begins to accrue people, not forgetting that all the people that have been coming to Jerusalem for a period of 4 years, he was at the gate speaking to all of them and obviously influencing their opinion. So what it meant is all those people stopped seeking David. They stopped seeking his counsel because he was blocking them. And so they got used to seeing Absalom. So then Absalom says, well, I'm the king's son, I'm in charge now. And so they go, okay. And so he comes back from Hebron to Jerusalem. David hears he's on his way, so he does a runner. He's on the hill on the opposite side when he enters the city. Then he goes down to Jericho. He's having dinner at night. He gets told by the spies, he's coming after you with all these men. You better not stay. So he goes all the way up to Mahanaim. The 3 different gentlemen from these 3 locations come and aid him. They build a small army, and then they go to fight here in this area of Gilead. David wins. His son gets his head stuck in a fork of a tree while he's riding his mule. His commander comes along, disobeys David and makes sure that he's done in, and then they bury him and hide him under the stone. So all that we've just gone through, that's the short version of what happens. And so we get to this point now where Absalom had a place that he had prepared for himself to be entombed. So like many great men in history, they prepare their own tombs and never make it into those tombs. And so now we have this relic, you would have to call it, and this is it. So this is Absalom's tomb, which is in Israel, in Jerusalem, where you can go to today. So again, this is the Mount of Olives behind, the Garden of Gethsemane. There's all the olive trees up the back. This is a little bit further along the path from where we were showing the previous photos. And you can see that this thing has been carved out of the rock. They've put some stones around there to preserve it. But this thing was carved solid out of the actual rock. And this is actually Absalom's tomb, as it's known, in the Kidron Valley, which is there for you to see today. Another wonderful piece of evidence that what the Bible says is truth. And so I'm going to take you to another short video. And this one is walking across the valley. Now we don't quite get to where, on this video, to seeing where that actual landmark is, but this is on the way there, and I'll explain it as we play it. So here we are, just come down off the side of good friend Roger, around the corner. So there's Zechariah's on the Temple Mount, and we're just dropping our way down these stairs. Ahead of you down the right. This is actually Zechariah's tomb. Zechariah's. And Absalom's further down along the bend here. So you can see the Mount of Olives at the back.
You put all of that Jewish graves here.
So the last video I showed while we was up here, looking back across.
Straight across there with the Orthodox Cathedral, all the gold domes on there, on the roof. So it's heading towards the Garden of Gethsemane is.
you can see this rock, it's all limestone, so everything's just carved out of limestone there. Sorry, just finding the place there again. So back to here. So walking along that path. No, walking along the path. So when you get further along towards, almost before you just come up out across the path that goes across the Kidron Valley there. So we were walking down from the beginning down the slope. As I said, you have Zechariah's tomb, you have Jehoshaphat's tomb, and then you have Absalom's tomb as well. So this, however, never had anybody inside because he was buried. So these are all there to be seen in Jerusalem today. So it's quite fascinating to read the Bible. Just keep in mind this happened 3,000 years ago. Right, so these monuments that we're looking at, they're all there today, 3,000 years old, part of biblical history. Okay, so King David, the Bible tells he'd been waiting anxiously. You can imagine he's back at the palace. He doesn't know what's going on yet, so we've already filled you in. So he's sitting between the inner and the outer gates of Mahanaim when the watchman went up to the gateway roof to look out. The watchman saw a lone man running towards him and called down, and King David replied in 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 25, "If he is alone, he must have good news." So we're just keep in mind, we're just progressing through the second book of Samuel as we're going. If he is alone, he must have good news. The watchman then called down a second time and informed him that another man was also running alone. David assumed he too must bring good news, because they were both running alone. The watchman identified the first runner and told the king it was Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. When he arrived, King David sought news of his son's safety, but Ahimaaz only declared the battle victory and evaded answering the question. So David, from the first person, knew that they had actually won. The watchman, so he told him to stand aside, and when the second runner arrived, he was told the same again. So King David's only concern, however, was for his son. But this time he learned that he was dead. Going up to the room above the gateway, King David wept, the Bible tells us. He asked for his son to be spared, but it was too late now, so he let his grief engulf him. So in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33, he says, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." So these are obviously words of grief, and David is obviously very saddened by what's happened. I think we can see in this the situation of the curse that God put upon him, because Absalom was turned against him. We read with King Saul with David too, don't we, that the favour of God was on David and God turned King Saul's heart against him. And so we see the same things happen here. So David's done the wrong thing and God has turned these people against him. I believe that David understands this because of the way his grief speaks. So another of God's punishments came to pass. One of David's descendants from the next generation was violently killed. Although David was anointed king and walked in God's favour, as a man of the flesh, he still sinned. He broke 2 of God's commandments, and they were, "Thou shalt not kill," and "Thou shalt not commit adultery." David was suffering the consequences: the death of his first son by Bathsheba, the violent death of 2 other sons, and the rape of 10 concubines. God, however, was merciful because David's life itself was spared. And so we see in short order that what God cursed him with happened very quickly. So this, however, was not the end of David's troubles. The nation, during the course of all this, had become divided, and the death of his son did not alleviate the circumstances. Throughout the tribes of Israel, they were arguing. They recognised that David had united them as a nation and overcome their enemies, especially the Philistines. David was anointed by God to rule Israel, but he had fled the country and they had anointed Absalom to rule them in his place. Do you notice the difference? David was anointed by God. Absalom was anointed by the people. So in other words, Absalom never had the authority under God to actually rule. And so there's a consequence for that. But now that Absalom had died in battle, the question is, should they bring David back to be their king? So when David's men returned from battle, they were unable to celebrate their victory, for they had heard that their king had been weeping over his son's death. So instead, they crept into the city of Mahanaim. King David had retired to the house he occupied there. His overwhelming grief continued, and he was heard by them crying out in 2 Samuel chapter 19 verse 4, so this is the second time, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." Immersed in his own grief, King David was interrupted when his nephew Joab entered his house. Of course, Joab was the one who used his 3 javelins to kill his son. So looking up, King David, so this is literally all in the family, all this, it's still going on. So looking up, King David saw before him a man seething in anger. And he says in 2 Samuel chapter 19 verse 5 to 6, "Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and the men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead." Pretty strong words. Joab's timely rebuke, however, moved David. He got up and went outside and took his seat in the gateway where his men came to see him. Joab had made it clear that if he didn't, that by the time the day had passed and the sun had set, all his men would abandon him. So obviously they were all talking about the situation amongst themselves, including Joab. Having just had his authority as God's anointed king challenged by his own son, Joab now challenged his authority as king again. The time had come for David to restore his throne. King David called for a messenger. He passed him a scroll with a wax seal of the house of David and instructed him to deliver this to the priests Zadok and Abiathar, who were still in Jerusalem. So now, whilst this is going on in Mahanaim, back in Jerusalem, news had been received of the death of Absalom. Men fleeing from the battle had been passing through the city, and they told of how Absalom had got caught in an oak tree by his head and had been slaughtered as he hung there. So news is going around while David's blissfully unaware of whom killed him, and the news is going around like a rumour that this is what actually happened to him, being stuck in the tree. So when Zadok and Abiathar heard this, they breathed a sigh of relief, for they did not want to serve a king anointed by the people. Okay, so they were priests of the God Most High. They were respectful of David's authority to rule under God. But they did want to serve David because of that reason. A messenger came from the city of Mahanaim and was brought to see them. Zadok and Abiathar thanked him and carefully broke the seal. And this is the message that David sent. It's written in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 11 to 13. And it says, "Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace? Since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters. You are my brothers, my own flesh and blood. So why should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, you are not my own flesh and blood. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if from now on you are not the commander of my army in place of Joab." And so he's finally clicked that Joab has actually killed his son, and he's saying he wants Amasa to fulfill that role as his chief in the commander position of the army. So King David receives word back from all of the men of Judah. He had won their hearts again, and they told him to return. So obviously they've got no other leader, no other king, and they're recognising that he was anointed by God, so they realise the error of their ways. So he thanked the people of Mahanaim, and Barzillai the Gileadite accompanied him and his people on the journey back down the escarpment to cross the plains of Moab to the Jordan River. The fords of the Jordan River can be seen from Gilgal. The men of Judah went there to wait to receive the king and help his household across the river. So we'll just pop the map back on. So there's the fords of Jericho, there's Jericho itself, and there's Gilgal, which is 10 kilometres north of Jericho today. So they could actually see them coming across the river there. So this is where they waited. The men of Judah went there to wait to receive the king and help him across the river, as it says. With them was Shimei, son of Gera the Benjamite from Bahurim, who had hurled abuse and stones at David when he left Jerusalem. 1,000 other Benjamites, and Ziba, the servant of the former king Saul, with his 15 sons and 20 servants. Mephibosheth, Jonathan's crippled son, also came from Jerusalem, but he came separately from the others. When they saw David, his household and his men coming across the plains of Moab, they all hurried to cross the ford of the Jordan River. Anyone know what happens here? Not a very familiar part of the Bible. Okay, so we'll read on. So as King David approached the ford to cross the river, he was taken aback by those who waded across to greet him. This Shimei, son of Gera, who had hurled abuse at him as he passed through Bahurim and he left Jerusalem, came and fell prostrate at his feet and asked for forgiveness. King David, remember, David didn't react. He accepted that this man was cursing him when he left because God had cursed him. He was accepting this almost as if it was part of the punishment that he received, that he's going to suffer from poor public opinion of him. So King David's nephew Abishai, who had asked to cut off this man's head before, now asked, should Shimei be put to death again? King David forgave Shimei and made an oath he would not die, but he turned on his nephew for challenging his authority again. These sons, you notice this with David through his journey, he's constantly got people around him who want to kill someone and take their head off all the time. It happens all the way through his journey, and he's saying, no, no, no. God will take care of it, or my authority will take care of it as God's anointed. And so this is happening again. So these sons of his sister Zeruiah had become like his enemies. Amasa had led the men of Israel against him for his son Absalom. Joab had killed his son Absalom against his wishes, and now Abishai sought to kill a man a second time whom he had said not to. So this Amasa, which David had said to appoint, he was doing that because he was upset at Joab for killing his other son Absalom. But now he's realising the truth of it, that this guy actually led the army against him, and so he's now realising that this man is against him. So King David needed to assert his authority at this point in time, and he said to Abishai in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 22, "This day you have become my adversaries. Should anyone be put to death in Israel today?" is his question. And another question, "Do I not know that today I am king over Israel?" So he's challenging them with his authority to rule over them. Next to greet King David was Mephibosheth, the crippled son of his beloved friend Jonathan. His appearance was dishevelled. He had not taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his moustache, nor washed his clothes since the day King David had left Jerusalem. So in other words, he's like he's in mourning. So King David asked him in verse 25, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He explained how he had saddled a donkey to go with King David, but he had been betrayed and slandered by Ziba, his grandfather's servant. King David remembered when he questioned Ziba, he had said of Mephibosheth, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks, today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom." So that's 2 Samuel chapter 16 verse 3. So we can see the false story that's coming out here. So King David ordered the fields recently given to Ziba to be divided between them, but Mephibosheth, who loved King David and respected the place he had given him at his table, simply said in verse 30, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has arrived home safely." So obviously he's come to love King David. He's Jonathan's son. King David's taken care of him, and so he doesn't care about the land or the inheritance anymore. So next King David turned to Barzillai the Gileadite. He asked him to come and stay in Jerusalem so he could provide for him in the same way that Barzillai had provided for him. But Barzillai was a wealthy and elderly man who just wanted to go home and live out his life amongst his people near the tomb of his parents. Instead, he gave his servant Kimham to King David and asked him to do with him whatever pleased the king. King David took him and told Barzillai he would do whatever pleased him. So David was taken to Gilgal, and the men of Israel came and challenged the men of Judah for bringing their king across the Jordan River without their involvement. So we can see they're still divided. The men of Judah responded in 2 Samuel chapter 19 verse 42, "We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you so angry about it? Have we eaten of any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves?" This only served to aggravate the men of Israel, and they answered in verse 43, "We have 10 shares in the king, and besides, we have a greater claim on David than you have. So why do you treat us with contempt? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king?" The men of Judah responded even more severely. Amongst the men there was a troublemaker called Sheba, son of Bichri, from the tribe of Benjamin. He blew his trumpet and he shouted in 2 Samuel chapter 20, verse 1, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent, O Israel." So the men of Israel left David to follow Sheba, but the men of Judah stayed with David as he made his way back to Jerusalem. This is not really surprising, is it? Because David was from the tribe of Judah. Right? They're his people, so their claim on him first is quite correct. The problem is that the people of Israel had actually came and fought against them. They had lost in battle, and now they wanted to serve him, to show them their loyalty to him. But the men of Judah say, "You came against our king. We're rightfully those who are going to take our king the rest of the way." And so they had a little session, having a go at each other, and then the people from Israel backed off and left the men of Judah to carry on. So when King David arrived back in Jerusalem, the Bible tells us he removed the 10 concubines that he had left to take care of the palace and had them kept in a separate house under guard. Because they had laid with Absalom in public, his actions declared that they were his. So from this day forward they would be confined and forced to live like widows, even though King David would continue to provide for them. By no means would he nor any other man lie with them. So King David then spoke to Amasa in 2 Samuel chapter 20 verse 4, and he says, "Summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days and be here yourself." So we can see David's come back and he's got to sort out everything. So Joab was no longer the commander over all of Israel's army. Absalom's death at his hands had angered David, and Amasa was appointed to replace him. 3 days passed and Amasa hadn't returned, so King David appointed Abishai to replace him. He explained to Abishai that Sheba, son of Bichri, was more of a threat than Absalom, and commanded him to pursue Sheba before he found fortified cities to escape from them. Abishai was placed in command over Joab's men, the Kerethites and Pelethites, and all the king's men. So David's come home, but he's got to tidy up the mess now. All these people that have come to fight against him, they still don't have any loyalty to him, and so he's come back to clean up. So the Bible tells us that Abishai led his men north out of Jerusalem along the way of Shur through the hill country, and they came to a great rock in Gibeon, and Amasa was there to meet them. And so this is the way to Shur, the highway that goes up through the hill country here. And so they head up through this particular road up here. Although Joab was no longer the commander over all of Israel's army, he was still a mighty warrior and commander of his men, and was amongst those under the command of Abishai. Joab went to meet his brother, but as he stepped forward, a dagger in his waist belt fell out of its sheath. Joab greeted his brother by taking his beard with his right hand to kiss him, and plunged his dagger into his belly, causing his intestines to split out on the ground. Very graphic, isn't it? Just as Joab took matters into his own hand when he killed David's brother Absalom, he again acted out of his own will to kill his own brother, who by his own understanding had unjustly been given the command of all of Israel's men. And so we find here that Joab's killed again. He's now killed the person that David appointed to replace him, and it's his own brother. And so Joab's character is very questionable. Do you remember where Joab came from? Who was Joab the commander of before David? Do you remember? He was actually King Saul's commander. Remember, King Saul's a Benjamite. King David's a Judahite. And so this man got a will of his own, and he takes matters into his hands constantly. He actually took matters into his hands against his own King Saul. Remember? And David said, no, the Lord will take care of this. But Joab never stopped. And so here he is, he's still the same character, still killing people, and now he's killed his own brother. So with Amasiah's death, one of Joab's men stood beside his body and called the other men to follow Joab. All of the men agreed. Abishai was still with them, but they followed Joab. Tossing Amasiah's body off the road, they pursued Sheba northwards. Sheba had passed through every tribe of Israel until he reached Abel Beth Makkah in the very north, next to Dan and Mount Hermon. And so this is all the way up to the top here. This is Makkah up here, Abel Beth Makkah. Okay, so he's gone all the way up here and found himself right at the very extreme north of the territory of Israel. And so they're pursuing him up there. When Joab and his men caught up with him, he was ensconced inside the city walls. Joab laid siege, built a ramp, and began to batter the wall when a wise woman called out. She declared it was a city of peace and didn't want it destroyed. Joab told her he only wanted Sheba, so her people cut off his head, and she threw it over the wall. Peace returned, and Joab returned to David in Jerusalem. Such a grisly story. Having quelled any opposition to his throne, David once again appointed those who would help him to govern the United Kingdom of Israel. With Amasa dead, Joab now continued as the commander over all of Israel's army, so he managed to retain his position. The Kerethites and Pelethites were still commanded by Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and a new need to manage forced labour was given to a man called Adoniram. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was once again court recorder. The secretary had changed from Zariah to Sheba. Zadok and Abiathar remained the priests, and new was Ira the Jairite appointed as David's personal priest. So David's again putting all his governance back into place for these people. With news of the death of Sheba, son of Bichri, David overcame the last threat to his sovereignty. So we're coming towards the end of this segment of the Bible. He had been truly humbled. He knew he had been paying the price for his sins, and he knew that it was only by God's grace that he was still alive. He put order back into the house of Israel, and the nation prospered until, with the passage of time, famine struck 3 years in succession. King David sought the Lord for a reason, and he answered in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1, "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." So in an incident that's not previously recorded in the Bible, King Saul had broken the treaty Israel made with the Gibeonites. So in other words, we're learning about something that happened in the past, now in the present. It wasn't recorded earlier in the Bible. During the time of Joshua, in 2 Samuel 21 verse 3, it says, "But Saul in his zeal for Israel and Judah had tried to annihilate them." Right, so Saul had been trying to remove these people. King Saul violated God's law, and the people of Israel let the stain of blood from his house go unpunished. All Israelites knew of the covenant of protection given to the Gibeonites, and even David, but time would not wear out the guilt of this sin, so for his people to prosper, God had to deal with this sin, and he cursed the land. So, last question for tonight, do you remember who the Gibeonites were? Do you remember the story? We've already covered this. So remember when they first went in under Joshua into the land, and they had these 5 men from Gibeon, and they came and they lied. They came in old clothes, they had mouldy bread.
Said they were from a distant land.
Right, said they were from a distant land, right. And so they lied to David, but David made a vow that he would always protect them. And so once he said they would protect them, they ended up with the battle where the sun didn't go down. Right? So they took care of all the kings that came against the Gibeonites. And so they'd made a vow, they'd sworn a pact with each other. And so of course King Saul was out to wipe them out. And so there was a blood feud between these two bodies of people. And so we find this popping up its head right now. So King David summons the Gibeonites, and he asks them in 2 Samuel 21 verse 3, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites knew they had no right to demand silver or gold, nor the right to put anyone in Israel to death. But they did request 7 of King Saul's descendants to be given to them, and in verse 6 it says, "To be killed and exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one." Anyone know what to be killed and exposed before the Lord means? There's lots of expressions in the Bible, and we don't necessarily know what they mean, so of course I am going to explain what this means. But does anyone know what it means?
Does it mean like hung from the gates or something?
It does mean being hung, but not from a gate, yeah. Because it talks about the word about being exposed.
It's drawn and quartered, like the old...
No, that's later in history.
Naked?
No. Sorry?
Naked?
Well, they're exposed, that's right. So they're going to be exposed to the elements, that's right. So you're pretty much onto it most of the time, so I'll explain. We're actually talking about a form of crucifixion. Crucifixion just didn't happen during the time of the Romans and the time of Christ. It's been around for a long, long time. And in fact, there's laws that are in the Bible that talks about this back in the time of Moses. And so this is not new. But so, carrying on with the story for the moment, King David agreed, for the ancient laws demanded that blood call for blood. And in Genesis chapter 9 verse 6 it says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made man." So in other words, you're not to kill your fellow man because it's God who created them. Okay? And so he has a law where it's basically an eye for an eye. This is Old Testament law. So he couldn't bear to let Jonathan's son Mephibosheth be among their number because of the oath he made with Jonathan before the Lord. So remember, he swore to Jonathan he would take care of him. So he's from the Benjamites. So just before the barley harvest began, King David handed over 2 sons of Rizpah. Now Rizpah is a concubine of King Saul, and 5 sons of Merab, which is King Saul's daughter, who had first been promised to him in marriage. Remember the first daughter? He falsely promised her. So suddenly it's coming back. Right? The daughter has 5 sons, and so they're going to be 5 of that number. So the Gibeonites, it says, took the 7 male descendants of King Saul given to them to Gibeah. They were simultaneously killed and exposed on a hill before the Lord there during the first days of the barley harvest. The Gibeonites had been put to death, deprived of their lands, and had their liberty taken from them by King Saul. So it was only fitting that these descendants were put to death in Gibeah to show that it was for his sin that they actually died. The famine had brought drought and a scarcity of provisions to the people of Israel. So the famine is as a result of sin. So the famine they were experiencing wasn't because there was a lack of water, it's because there was a curse because of the sin. And so we find this out here now, that in order to break the famine, they need to deal with the sin. Modern lesson we can have from that one. Right? Circumstances different, but still the same lesson. If you're in a famine in life, you need to deal with sin. Otherwise, there'll be a consequence for you. It makes sense, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. If we've done something wrong, we need to deal with it if we want to be blessed. You can't cover it up and carry on and think that everything will just go on regardless. And so this is the backbone of what's being said here. So King Saul's concubine Rizpah went to where her 2 sons were sacrificed and spread sackcloth out on a rock to protect herself from the weather, the Bible tells us. She did not attempt to violate the sentence placed upon them and remove their bodies for burial, but rather she patiently protected them from the birds of prey during the day and wild animals during the night. She did this until the rains came down on their bodies and the price had been paid for the sin of King Saul's house. So there's a few laws at play here which we're going to explain. I'm just going to finish the story first and then we'll explain it all. So King David was told this heartbreaking news of how Rizpah, King Saul's concubine, had cared for the body of her sons while they hung exposed to the weather on the hill there in Gibeah. It touched him so much that he went to a place called Jabesh Gilead and exhumed the bones of King Saul and his beloved Jonathan from under the tamarisk tree where they had been buried. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 31 verse 13. And there's Jabesh Gilead, so this is where Jonathan and King Saul was buried. Remember, their bodies were hung up on the wall at Bethshan, and the battle where they were beaten by the Philistines was over here at Mount Gilboa. So these are those past locations. So he goes up to there and exhumes these bodies. So King David, it says, brought the bones back to Gibeah and had the deteriorated bodies that hung on the post brought down and prepared for burial. So I've just given it away. The bones of King Saul, his sons Jonathan, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and his 5 grandsons born by his daughter Merab, were all buried in the tomb of Kish, King Saul's father, at Zelah in Benjamin. So in other words, David honoured their family by burying them all together, even though all of this sin had happened. After this, the prayers for prosperity of the land were once again answered by God. So in other words, he corrected everything, and so the blessing came back to the land. The famine ended and the rains returned. You might remember that when Rizpah was there taking care of her sons while they hung dead, that the rains began to fall again. So this is the blessing back on the land. And so we come back to the last point tonight. What does killed and exposed mean? In Deuteronomy chapter 21 verses 22 to 23. So again, Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 to 23. The Bible says, if a man guilty of a capital offence is put to death and his body is hung on a tree, you must not leave his body on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury him that day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land your God is giving you as an inheritance. And so what the actual scene was that was presented, and I've done an illustration for you. This is what was happening. They were on a hill. There were 7 men. They were hung upon a tree, and they were crucified on a single post. And in the old scripture, it talks about it being a post. In the time of Christ, they talk about the crucifixion being in the shape of a cross. But they used to crucify people by hanging them on a post or nailing them to a post. And so with their bodies exposed, it means that the majority of their clothes are removed. And this method of hanging people, just at the time of Christ, is excruciatingly painful and causes the lungs to collapse, and they die fairly quickly. However, in this particular story, it actually says here that these bodies in Deuteronomy, that they're not to be left hung on the tree for longer than a day, because there will be a curse. And yet we read in this story that they didn't just leave them for a day. They were there for several days until the rain started and the famine broke. So we see that this actually is a different situation, and the reason is because the curse was on the land. The bodies were paying the price for the curse on the land. And when the curse lifted, meaning the rain started, the bodies were allowed to be taken down. So let's go forwards in history and we come to the time of Christ. What's the story of Jesus? He was hung on the cross. At what time? Do you remember?
3 o'clock.
When was he hung on the cross?
Midday, no?
He was on the cross.
Midday.
And he died at?
3.
Okay. So his body was taken down and buried before dusk.
Yeah. The end of the day.
Why? Because if it wasn't done, his death would have been a curse upon the people, and so his body had to be removed. And so this recognition of Jewish law was done by the wealthy man, Joseph, wasn't it? Yes, his name was Joseph. He came and took the body and buried him in his own tomb.
Yeah.
So this was actually fulfilling this law back from Deuteronomy, and this story and this curse is associated with the same law. So David, when he asked in 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 3, he asked the Gibeonites, "How shall I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The sin of the former king's blood-stained house broke God's law and the covenant made between the Israelites and the Gibeonites. The punishment demanded by God's wrath came in the form of a famine that cursed the land. The only price acceptable to God for sin is the spilling of blood. So to satisfy God's ancient law of blood for blood, the Gibeonites demanded the death of those who had spilt their blood, and that price was agreed to by David. 7 of Saul's descendants were given to be sacrificed. Their sacrifice in Gibeah publicly exposed the sin of the former king's family. They were killed and exposed, meaning hung on a tree or a post for all of Israel to witness. So it's a public demonstration that a price had been paid. Normally, God's law demanded those who were guilty of a capital offence be buried by the end of the day. This was because their judgment was complete and they were under God's curse. Remember, Jesus, when he was on there, right, there's a judgment. It's a judgment day. Do we understand what that means? Man had been judged as guilty of sin. So in order to overcome the curse, the price had to be paid. But so that the land wasn't cursed and the people weren't cursed, he had to be brought down and buried before dusk. This law fulfills and connects to the story that we know of Jesus. But on this occasion, even though Saul's descendants are dead, they were left hanging until rain returned to the land because God's judgment was incomplete and the land was cursed, and that's why they stayed there longer. Okay, so I'm going to finish on this note. This is actually the end of this section of the Bible, if you will, the story of Absalom challenging for the Bible. In fact, all of the family members killing each other, and David had to come back and re-establish his authority under God on the land. The land was also cursed, and so this had to be fulfilled in order that the curse was lifted off the land. Can you understand that with 3 years of famine, if I'm a ruler and my people are starving, how do they look to me as their ruler? I'm failing. My people are starving. What am I going to do about it? David said yes to this because he needed to end the curse, which is affecting him, the people, the land, in order that prosperity could return back to the land again. And so when he took authority in this situation to right the sin, he basically set a new chapter for what was going to come ahead. Right? He never wanted his son or King Saul or anyone killed because he understands that he will be cursed. The funny thing was, he slept with Bathsheba and he had Uriah, her husband, killed, and so he knew exactly what a curse was. He was cursed. He suffered under the consequences of the curse. He was not surprised by what happened to him because he had done the wrong thing. So now he had to correct what he'd done. He also had to correct what the land and the previous rulers had done as well. And so this brings us to this point in close. So we'll close on this note. Sorry, it's been a long lesson. It's one of those parts of the Bible where it's all connected together, so it's a bit hard to split it into two. But there's many sort of things to learn from this, and obviously how God expects us to actually deal with those situations in our lives. So I thank you, and we'll say good night to those who have joined us online. God bless you and stay safe.
Amen.